Hello, and welcome to the next edition of the Capital Stewards podcast. Today, we're going to dive into immigration or migrant workers stealing American jobs. What is the real story that's going on around immigration in the United States? There's two major storylines that I think are shining a spotlight on immigration. The first, the monthly jobs report that comes out every month. You may hear that referred to as Jobs Friday. It continues to outperform expectations, largely due to foreign-born workers. And the second is that we're entering, as you can probably tell, a presidential election cycle where the current crisis at the border is going to be a really hot topic of debate. Some view what can only be described, I think, as a sort of wide open southern border as a significant problem. And there's news stories every day about crimes that are committed by illegal immigrants. That seems to hit the news every night. The Bible teaches us that we should love foreigners and refugees. And from an economic perspective, immigrants might be contributing to disinflation. So, how do we reconcile all that? What does the data say about immigration and employment in America in this period of time after the pandemic? What should we really think about immigration? What should policies be? So, in this edition of the podcast, we're going to dive into all things immigration and look at what's really been happening under the covers over the last couple of years. So before we go too far, it's really important to separate the policy stance on illegal or undocumented, unmonitored immigration from legal immigration. I don't see how it's possible for good things to come from letting unmonitored individuals, regardless of their affiliations, political beliefs, especially if you're not checking their criminal and military history, into any country. I don't think good things come from that. That includes the US. So it seems like an easy invitation if you just have a sort of a wide open border for bad actors to come into the country to commit crimes on both sort of large and small scale. So regardless of the data that we're going to talk about today, the perspectives that I share on immigration, I think simply allowing somebody into the country because we want more immigration is not a good policy idea. We're going to talk a lot about the impact of illegal immigration on wages and the economy, but I don't want anybody to walk away confusing sort of the idea between immigration and illegal immigration and thinking that sort of illegal immigration and having more undocumented workers in the U.S. Is a good idea. I don't think that's a good idea. And I think the results are pretty clear in what we see happening in day-to-day life that that's not a good idea. But we have to be able to separate, I think, those two concepts, so legal immigration and illegal immigration. So since this is such a hot topic, let's start with the facts on immigration statistics. In 2019, immigration into the U.S., including illegal immigrants, was about 415,000 people, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. That was a lower year than what we've seen over the past decade. Immigration figures in the 2010s typically range somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million workers per year. In 2023, so fast forward a couple of years post-pandemic, the CBO estimates that 3.3 million immigrants came into the U.S. They expect that trend to continue this year in 2024. We certainly haven't seen any signs so far that it's slowing down. And the difference is, by the way, almost entirely undocumented workers or illegal immigrants. The number of work visas and legal permanent workers is relatively constant, right? 800,000 folks a year. So for reference, the workforce is about 167 million people. When we're looking at sort of 3% growth in GDP, having almost 2% labor force growth from immigration is really significant. So how are all these people impacting the economy and the labor market? And is this flood of immigrants sort of a good thing or a bad thing for the economy? So let's start with population growth. When we look at the economy, growing the economy requires at least one of three things to be true, period. There's no other way to grow an economy besides these three things. Either more people work, the existing people work more hours, or workers are more productive with the existing hours that they spend working. There is no other way to produce more stuff. If you think about it just naturally, you either got to get more people, the people that you have to work more hours, or you have to be able to do more with the hours that you have. It's just sort of arithmetic. The first chart that we're going to look at shows the population growth in the US, and you can see that as our birth rate has declined, we're not replacing our population each year. In fact, we rely more and more on immigration to grow our total population and workforce. So we don't have more people without immigration. The second chart shows the number of hours worked during the average work week. You can see that hasn't really changed much over the past decade since they started tracking these numbers back in the early 2000s. We aren't working anymore. Lastly, you can see productivity. There are well-reasoned arguments against productivity as a statistic, mostly because it's solved for after we measure GDP, the number of hours, the number of people works, and we sort of say, hey, what's left is productivity. But I think any fair-minded person can see that technology helps people become more productive over time. And in the US, productivity has been growing about 2% a year for the past few decades. That's really responsible for the GDP growth or for the growth in the economy that we've seen. So without any immigration, we are relying on sort of paltry productivity growth to offset our declining population and sort of flat work hours. That doesn't sound like a recipe to me for long-term success. So we do need immigration to drive economic growth and GDP growth, business growth and wealth creation in the United States. So let's go a level deeper and look just past population growth and past sort of the theoretical GDP growth and look at the workforce in the US. Since 2019, the US born workforce is down. The same is true over the last 12 months. The foreign born workforce is responsible for all of the growth in the workforce over the past couple of years. When we dive into the stats here, it's kind of important to understand what we mean by foreign born. That's what you'll see in the Labor Department statistics. The foreign born category measures anyone in the US, um, most likely legally here, that was born in another country. They might be US citizens that were naturalized at some point, perhaps after school. Maybe they came here to get educated and they got naturalized. They might have gotten married to a US citizen, or they may have just moved here and lived here for a long time and become naturalized. Or perhaps they're still working on a visa. They've been working on a visa for a long time. But the foreign-born category does include a lot of things. Obviously, recent immigrants make up a big portion of the foreign-born category, but it's more than just immigrants. It's not a measure of illegal versus legal immigrants. It's not a measure of U.S. citizens versus non-citizens. It's simply the question is really just where were you born? Were you born in the U.S. or were you born somewhere else? And if you're born somewhere else, then you're the foreign-born population. So that foreign-born population has been responsible for all of the workforce growth over the last couple of years. So that kind of begs the question, are all of those foreign-born folks stealing jobs from native-born workers? Or are native-born Americans choosing not to work because maybe it's harder to work because their jobs are taken? And here's a few data points that I think helps answer this question. Workforce participation among prime age workers, measured by either ratio that we show on the page, is closer to highs for the century than it is to the averages or to the lows. So more people are participating in the US workforce, period. Labor force participation rates among foreign and native born groups tend to move together. We don't see really high participation among foreigners and lower participation among native born workers that would be sort of indicative of foreign born workers stealing jobs from native born Americans. You don't see that happening. We don't see a significant difference between the unemployment rates for native and foreign born workers. In fact, unemployment across most demographic groups in the US is at all-time lows. The employment market's been really strong over the last couple of years coming out of the pandemic. There's not a lot of people that are looking for jobs that aren't able to find one. And then lastly, there's always this debate about sort of uneducated men. Are they particularly, disproportionately impacted by illegal immigrants, particularly those coming from Latin America? And even uneducated men have not seen sort of unusual workforce participation declines during the immigration boom, especially when you look at this over the last couple of years. More and more of the sort of least educated men are going back to work. They're participating in the workforce in the same rates that they always have. So now, do immigrants work and do they steal jobs? I think are two different questions. Foreign workers are coming to the US and they're working. The Center for Immigration Studies made the point in the 2018 article that there are no jobs that Americans won't do. And I think that's true. There are actually more Americans. I think this is maybe a misconception that folks have. There are more Americans employed in industries that are commonly staffed by foreign workers, for the most part, than there are foreign workers. There are lots of American cooks, American-born construction workers and housekeepers, et cetera. The question, though, is, are there enough to keep up with the demands of an economy, particularly in service sectors that are growing in demand? They're increasingly more and more in demand to have folks in those jobs. Is there enough of that in the American workforce? And the answer to that is no. We know that all the recent workforce growth has been from foreign-born workers. If there were Americans that were there to do those jobs in the service sector, then they would probably be hired if they wanted to work in those spaces. The reality is we're seeing Americans that want to work, that are native-born, work other places in other sectors, and that's an okay decision to make. So in my view, the evidence is pretty clear. Foreign workers are here. They are working, and mostly alongside native-born Americans who are also employed at generationally high levels. It takes both kinds of workers, both native-born Americans and foreign-born workers, in order to make the economy grow. I mentioned earlier that foreign workers don't have a negative impact on native born American workers taking their jobs. They're not stealing their jobs. But if they aren't stealing their jobs, what is the impact? When we look at the wages for lower income Americans, they've largely kept up over the economic cycle. But supply and demand are sort of real forces. The influx of foreign workers in service sectors like housekeeping and construction necessarily keeps wages from growing for native born workers in those fields to the same extent that they would if there was no immigration. If there was no immigration, and we don't have a study of this because we don't live in a world where there's no immigration, but if there was no immigration, it's pretty likely that wages would need to be higher to attract workers in those areas. This though is the challenge with sort of just saying, oh, well, clearly, immigration drives down wages. Higher service sector wages would probably drive overall inflation higher. So I'm not actually sure that workers in those spaces would be any better off. We would just not be able to supply the goods that are demanded by the economy. That creates inflation. And as everyone has experienced over the last couple of years, higher pay doesn't necessarily mean a better standard of living. Inflation's not good. And it's particularly not good for folks at the lower end of the economic cycle that we're talking about, or the lower end of the economic spectrum that we're talking about here. So I don't know necessarily that anybody would be better off without immigrants coming in and working in certain sectors, but I don't think you can argue rationally that sort of a firm wouldn't have to pay more, holding all things equal, if they were limited to only hiring U.S. born workers, because there would be fewer workers, and that should drive up the price. And that kind of goes to another point, the last economic point I'll make here that I think is really important. The increase in immigration, both legal and illegal, over the last couple of years has been one of the key contributors to inflation moving lower. We have not seen demand for goods or services contract in the US. We got through a period of COVID. We had really high inflation. So we saw the Federal Reserve raise interest rates. And the point of doing that was to slow down the economy. However, US real retail sales are up more than 10% since 2019. They've only declined 1.2% since the 2022 inflation peak. So, they're really flattish over the last couple of years. What you're really seeing is demand. It's not continuing to grow as rapidly as it was coming out of COVID, but it's just sort of flatlined. Yet inflation has come down pretty remarkably. The other thing that's come down is average hourly earnings. Average hourly earnings are down 17% since the inflation peak in 2022. So our capability to deliver goods and services has grown significantly over that time period. And that's largely due to the expansion of the foreign-born labor workforce. So like I said, I don't think those folks are stealing jobs from Americans, because I think otherwise those jobs would just simply be unstaffed or unfilled and we would have higher levels of inflation. But I do think that they are probably helping keep wages, down and certainly in reasonable levels that are consistent with lower levels of inflation across the economy. I don't know if that increased level of immigration was an intentional policy of the Biden administration or if it was a happy accident. Sometimes I think governments tend to have more happy accidents than they do sort of intentional policy, sort of goodness. But either way, it's been important in driving down inflation over the last couple of years because they've been continuing to spend in Washington, right? So spending is going up. We're not seeing demand slow down tremendously across the economy. Interest rates have gone up a lot. So it's been the ability to supply workers or sort of immigration that has helped to keep a lid on inflation over the last couple of years. The big sort of but that I get a lot of times is, okay, Brian, well, it sounds like you're making a case for we need to have immigration, we need to have more immigration, maybe we need to do a better job at the border, but we need to have more immigrants in the country. The common objection I hear is, well, what about all the crime that we hear about on the news, right? And that has been particularly true, and there have been some really terrible, horrific stories that have come out over the last couple of months. There's research out of Stanford recently that shows pretty definitively, actually, that immigrants, though, are less likely to be incarcerated than native-born Americans. So do immigrants commit horrible crimes? Absolutely. In my view, much of that crime is associated with cartels and gangs and bad folks that are bad that come across the border to do bad things. And so in my view, better border enforcement, stronger controls at the border should be able to weed out the bad guys that come into our country to do harmful things. The remainder of that global population are generally people of goodwill. They come here to build their families, to build their incomes, to work, to do all the same things that any American wants to do. So I think you can be pro-immigrant, pro-immigration, and anti-illegal immigration all at once. And I think that's probably the right stance in order for us to continue to have the economic growth that we want to see in the US. So what does all that mean in conclusion? I think first, Legal immigration into the US is a good thing. Immigrants do not steal jobs from Americans, though they do probably likely contribute to lower wages in some industries that have heavy immigrant workforces. The US needs immigration to continue to grow the economy unless everyone's going to start having more babies. And I encourage that. But I'm doubtful that that's going to become a trend across the economy. We've got to have more immigration if we're going to continue to grow the economy. I think we should encourage less educated workers, native born Americans that are less educated to gain skills that are going to enable them to be more specialized than entry level migrant workers. I think that's pretty easy to do. That doesn't have to come with significant secondary education requirements. We don't have to send everybody to 9 years of college, all that kind of stuff. But I think we can do things that will make American workers more specialized. And then lastly, I think to have the right level of legal immigration in the United States, we need immigration reform. We need to have more visas of almost all types. We need better border security so that we understand who is coming into the country. And I think you can do both at the same time. I don't think that this is an area where you have to choose one or the other. I think you can have more immigrants, more great people coming in the country to work and build our economy, and better border security to weed out the bad guys all at one time. So I think you can do all of those things. So I hope this kind of quick tour of immigration and what has been happening and what hasn't been happening over the last couple of years is helpful as we start to sort of move into a political season where I think immigration is going to be a top topic of debate. And hopefully this arms you with some facts on sort of what has really been happening and what's really good about immigration and what's challenging and what things we should continue doing as a country and maybe some things we should do differently. So with that, thanks for listening to this episode of The Capitol Stewards. You can find more information about how to connect with us in the links on the show notes to this page. Certainly like and subscribe to the show if you haven't already done that. And we look forward to talking to you soon.